All right, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. This is the inaugural Idaho 911. We're going to talk about the Frank Steunenberg assassination. And I'm Robert Parrott. I work in the special collections here at the University of Idaho Library. So this was hailed at the time as the crime of the century. I will note that it took place in 1905. There may have been other things that happened later in the 20th century. I'm not totally sure, but at the time, crime of the century. What had happened was that former Governor Frank Steunenberg was coming home after a night of socializing at the Hotel Saratoga. It was only like 8 p.m., so it wasn't too bad. He was wandering home through the snow. When he got to his garden gate, he opened it up and he found out that there was a homemade bomb attached to it. He was blown about 10 feet in the air and lost about 40% of his body. And it took him an hour to die. So I think they at least had morphine back then. So hopefully there was morphine involved, but that was not a great way to go. And maybe even worse, his wife saw it happen. She was looking out the window, watching him walk up to the house when it happened. So that was a lot of unfortunate things happening all at once there. So let's talk about some of the parties involved here. And I'm just going to describe this a little bit, and then I've got some things here for the people in the room to take a look at and handle, and I'll hold them up to the camera as well. But Frank Steunenberg, of course, is at the heart of this. He lived from 1861 to 1905. He was a governor one time from 1897 to 1901. He had been elected on a labor ticket. So it was labor and union members that had elected him. And then unfortunately, there was a labor riot that we're going to talk a little bit about. And in that riot, he called in military help. And that sort of turned all the labor and union members against him. So he didn't run for re-election. He only had that one term as governor. Before and after he was governor, he was a journalist. He actually moved to Idaho to restart the Caldwell paper with his brother. That was what he had been doing before he became governor. And he has a memorial statue in Boise. And on that statue, he's described as rugged in body, resolute in mind, massive in the strength of his convictions. He was of granite hewn. So that was Frank. The person that ends up being convicted of his assassination was Harry Orchard, who lived from 1866 to 1954. He actually outlives everybody else involved in this by several decades. Among his many things that were attributed to him, he's Canadian, and his other shortcomings were that he was a logger, a cheesemaker, a miner, a labor organizer, a burglar, a sheep wrestler, an insurance fraud, and a would-be kidnapper. He actually planned 2 different kidnappings of actual children, so actual kidnapping for money, but he didn't follow through on either of them. As part of his confession for this, he claimed to have committed 16 other political assassinations, but the police couldn't verify any of those. So we started to see maybe some credibility issues potentially cropping up here with Harry. James McPherson was the detective, quote unquote, that was investigating this case. He lived from 1844 to 1919. He was a Pinkerton agent. Pinkerton was a private security firm. The Pinkertons, many of them went directly into the Secret Service when that was formed. So it was kind of a private security firm that turned into the Secret Service. Eventually, I think the Pinkertons continue to exist, but it kind of bifurcated into those 2 organizations. He was previously famous for going undercover with the Molly Maguires, who were an Irish gang that was affiliated with mining organizations in the Northeast. They also feature in The Valley of Fear, which is a Sherlock Holmes novel. And he appears in that novel, and the Molly Maguires appear in that novel as well. So he was definitely famous before this, but he actually spent most of his time as a strike breaker rather than a detective. And almost everything he did in this investigation was later declared illegal. So he was the bad cop, and there wasn't exactly a good cop involved. James Hawley was the prosecuting attorney. He lived from 1847 to 1929. He was also an Idaho governor later, like two governors later. He was the governor. Just previous to this, he'd been the Boise mayor. And he was later a prosecutor on many labor violence cases. One thing about this whole situation is that it was actually good for everybody's career but the judge. The judge kind of took all the political fallout, but he went on to have a very successful careers with a politician and a prosecutor. All the defense attorneys had very successful careers after this. And then Harry Orchard, as we'll see, had his own kind of success after this. But he was one of the people that benefited from this in a way. And he was also president of the Idaho State Historical Society and really was involved in making that into what it is today. So Williamorah is probably familiar to many of you. He was a famous Idaho senator, was a senator for over 30 years for the state of Idaho, US senator, lived from 1865 to 1940. He was known as a maverick Republican, and he had personal beef with Taft, Roosevelt, and Coolidge. And he, unfortunately, he decided that he wanted to negotiate with Hitler to avoid involvement in the Second World War. So he was for peace at all costs, which sounds great until you're negotiating with Hitler. And maybe it sounds a little bit less great, but that was Williamorah, who was one of the defense attorneys. And the other was Clarence Darrow, who was another person you're probably somewhat familiar with. He was previously famous for the Leopold and Loeb murders, which was a case in which two University of Chicago students wanted to prove how smart they were by getting away with murder. So they kidnapped and killed a 14-year-old who was actually the cousin of, I believe, Loeb. He was one of their cousins anyway. But his dad, the cousin's dad, was rich, and so they kidnapped him, murdered him, and then tried to ransom him by pretending that he was still alive. And so they thought they were going to prove how smart they were by both getting away with the murder and extracting all this money for a kid that was already dead. That didn't go so well for them. They were found out and they were arrested, and they ended up actually confessing. They both confessed that the other one did the murder. So they remained class acts to the end, but they were almost certainly going to be executed for it. And Clarence Darrow was staunchly against the death penalty. So he took this case purely to defend them against receiving the death penalty. And in that he was successful. They were sent to life in prison, plus 99 years. But they didn't get the death penalty, so he was successful there. And he was also involved in the Scopes monkey trial, which was the famous trial where the idea of teaching evolution in public schools was put to the test in Kansas. He was involved in that as well. In this case, he was defending the Western Federation of Miners for much the same reason as Leopold and Loeb. The people that were on trial were almost certainly going to get the death penalty for it. And so he got involved to put an end to the death penalty being involved. Unfortunately, he was known to bribe jurors throughout his career. He actually had to change both where he practiced law and the type of law he practiced several times because he kept getting busted for bribing jurors. But he wasn't negotiating with Hitler, so still comes out looking pretty good. And the other group involved in this was the Western Federation of Miners. They were founded in 1893, and they were actually founded based on a riot that happened in Coeur d'Alene in 1892. It was a mining riot. Strike breakers were brought in from Wisconsin, and there was actually like shooting in the streets, Wild West style. 5 miners were killed, and they ended up driving the strike breakers out of town. And so President Harrison declared martial law and brought soldiers in, and they illegally imprisoned 600 miners. And that caused all these other little smaller unions to say, like, gee, we can't really stand up to the federal government on our own. So they became one giant union instead in the Western Federation of Miners. And we've got some of their newsletters here we can look at the end, but we unfortunately don't have the super cool ribbon that's from somewhere else, but we have their newsletters. But we're most concerned with the labor riot of 1899. And this happened at the Bunker Hill and Sullivan mines. Those were the only mines that were not unionized in the Silver Valley at this time. And the Western Federation of Miners was sort of constantly buzzing around and agitating the people that worked at these mines to unionize. And in April of 1899, the owners of these mines made the very unfortunate decision to declare they'd rather close the mines down than allow unionization. And that was not received very well. And we can kind of see here the outcome of how that was not received very well. This is the Bunker Hill mine. And we'll see on the next slide what happened to it, but this was the ultimate result of them saying they'd rather close down than be unionized. So the reaction to that was on April 29th, 250 union members from other mines, because of course the Bunker Hill mine wasn't unionized, but the other miners that were unionized hijacked a train. They drove it all the way across much of Idaho. Along the way, other miners hopped onto the train. So by the time it got to the Bunker Hill mine, there was 1,000 angry miners on this train. And while they were driving cross country in their hijacked train, they were also loading up dynamite at various spots, particularly in Frisco. When they got to the Bunker Hill mines, they forced everybody who was there out at gunpoint and occupied the mine, planted every single building with dynamite, and blew every single building in the Bunker Hill mine up. And this is not the actual Dynamite Express. This is that track, and this is that year, but it's not necessarily that train. I don't know that it's not that train, but this isn't a picture of that happening. This is a picture of a train on the right track in the right year.
Did they call that train the Dynamite Express?
They called it. And actually, the Wallace sheriff was one of the people that was on board, which is interesting. So,
Wow. Is he also a minor?
no, he wasn't a minor, but he was
Confused.
confused. Yeah, he was pro-union at the time. And so, in response, President McKinley sent him the army, but interestingly, he sent him the 24th Regiment, which was the largest body of Buffalo soldiers, which were the famous African-American soldiers that served in the Spanish-American War. And a lot of people think that that was intentional, that they were intentionally adding a layer of race tension, because of course, the North Idaho mining towns were like 99% white, as they continue to be. So they, and whether that racial tension was meant to distract or whether it was meant to inflame, people think that racial tension was intentional. They intentionally sent this particular regiment in to make the situation worse in one way or another. And they were ordered to arrest every single man. Not every single miner, not every single union member, every single man in the Silver Valley. And of course, these small little Idaho mining towns were not equipped to have 50% or more of the population in jail at once. And so they stuck the first 150 in a barn, and then they started cramming people into boxcars. And when they ran out of boxcars, they had the prisoners build their own prison out of plywood and barbed wire. And all these guys were just snatched up off the street with no warning. Presumably once the snatching happened, there was some sort of warning that it was happening, but there was no warrant process. There was no sort of like due legal process. The soldiers would just go through and grab any man they saw. They'd grab them out of their homes. They'd grab them out of businesses. And if they weren't wearing a coat when they were grabbed, they didn't have a coat. And some of these guys were in these shacks for up to 8 months. Half that time was winter. Even when it wasn't winter, it got cold at night. There were no blankets, no coats, if they weren't already wearing them. And you can see there's eating their food off the ground inside their shack there. Of course, this was all declared illegal as soon as somebody else looked at it. It was declared illegal within about 2 weeks, which back in the day was probably relatively fast. But it took 8 months for them to actually release all the prisoners. And these people, again, had no warrants. Most of them had the mistake of being a man in the Silver Valley at the wrong time. And they were held for up to 8 months of these conditions. And it was they arrested over 1,000 men in 2 weeks, but took 8 months to let them out. There was really only one person that pushed back against this just because it was so overwhelming. The military occupation was overwhelming, but William H. Stewart of the Munyer, editor of the Munyer, wrote a bunch of editorials, objected to the bullpen, objected to the occupation, objected to the lack of due process. And of course, that was responded with by him being arrested on charges of sedition, inciting a riot, and insurrection. He was sent to the very bullpen that he complained about, and the only thing he was allowed to do was clean latrines. So he spent about 4 months cleaning shack latrines. And while he was doing that, his wife kept publishing the paper. They apparently were less inclined to throw her in the bullpen, so instead they seized all the lead type, so the paper physically could not be printed anymore. And so she contracted with another newspaper elsewhere. So the paper was printed elsewhere and then shipped back in. And then finally her husband was released, and apparently 4 months of shack latrine cleaning was enough for him. He sold the newspaper and they moved away. But they were basically the only people who pushed back against this at all in a formal way. The other important location besides the Garden Gate is the Hotel Saratoga. This was the last place that Frank Steunenberg was seen, sort of socializing with his friends. It's also where Harry Orchard was staying. He stayed there for several weeks before the assassination. He was posing as a sheep buyer, and that's actually what got him in trouble, because he sort of went around and had these meetings with various farmers, but never bought any of their sheep. And after a while, that started rubbing him the wrong way. Like he was just kind of wasting their time, and what was he doing there if he was not actually buying sheep? And so that's what eventually caught up with him. When they started looking for suspicious characters, people said, like, this guy is weird. Like, you know, wasted half my morning, didn't buy any of my sheep. And he did that to my neighbor and his neighbor too. And when that happened, the police that were investigating, or the national authorities that were investigating, actually recognized Harry Orchard from the previous labor riot. When he had been using yet another pseudonym, Harry Orchard's also a pseudonym. And so he was there doing suspicious things under a false name, and that was enough for them to detain him. And then 2 days later, they actually formally arrested him when they found bomb-making materials in his hotel room. And I read various accounts of this, and they all have described slightly different things that were found. It might have been a gas can, it might have been a blasting cap. It was probably a couple of sticks of dynamite. It was probably a disassembled revolver where the trigger was used as a triggering mechanism for the bomb. And for some reason, paper mache is suspicious. I'm not sure how paper mache is used in making a bomb, but there was some damning paper mache potentially in his room as well. I guess, I don't know. I don't make bombs. So at this hotel, Orchard actually just after the explosion, after he had murdered Steunenberg, he just went back to the hotel afterwards. He went and talked to the night manager for a while. He went to the bar and had like a drink, chatted with the bartender for a while, and then actually went back out to the bomb site with the hotel staff to just gawk at it because everybody in town had heard the bomb go off. And he just goes back to his room, goes to sleep, no big deal, until the next day when he's finally arrested. So after he's arrested, we get a confession from him where he confesses to those total of 17 assassinations, only one of which they can find any evidence for. And he claimed he was hired by these three men, William Dudley Haywood, Charles Munyer, and George Pettibone. And all three of these men were illegally renditioned from Colorado to Idaho. Does anybody know what rendition means? It's a charge that's usually applied to the military. It's when you remove somebody from one jurisdiction to another illegally. And like in general, it's not something that you or I could do. If you or I did it, it would just be kidnapping. But when the military does it, it's rendition. But they ended up, the figures that removed them from Colorado ended up being charged with rendition. So the first person they try is Big Bill Haywood. And the reason they tried Big Bill Haywood first is he was a flamboyant character. They knew he was going to say some crazy stuff up on the stand. They basically thought he was going to convict himself. You can't quite see it in this photo, but that right eye is actually dead. He'd been in an accident when he was a kid, so like those cheek muscles didn't move, that eye didn't move. He was very large, so he looked like a villain, and they knew he was going to get up on the stand and say some inflammatory things. So they thought, this is great, this guy's going to convict himself, this is a slam dunk. And that actually backfired on them because he stood up to cross-examination really well. Both Orchard and Haywood were cross-examined for days. Orchard, while his story remained consistent, he broke down during those cross-examinations. He would cry, he would get angry, and those sorts of emotional reactions were perceived as weakness on the stand. Big Bill Haywood just rolled with it. Like they couldn't do anything that would shake him at all. And because he was, and that sort of hyper masculinity, hyper toughness was read well on the stand. And so a combination of that and Darrow's closing remarks where he elucidated that there was no substantiating evidence, independently substantiating evidence against Big Bill Haywood. All the evidence they had was the testimony of Harry Orchard. And Harry Orchard, some of his other things didn't pan out when we tried to follow up on things he'd claimed. So the evidence was actually pretty weak. And because of that, he was actually found innocent. He continued to be a labor organizer. So several years later, he was convicted for sedition in a separate case. And he went to Moscow and lived out the rest of his life in Moscow, like actual Russian Moscow, Russia, not Moscow, Idaho. And there's even, if you Google him, pictures of him with like the big furry Russian hat and stuff. But yeah, he spent the last of his life in the USSR.
And he ran for governor?
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, while he was in jail, where he'd been illegally renditioned, in Idaho, he ran for governor of Colorado, and he got a big chunk of the vote. He was the person on the socialist ticket, and this is before the world wars or anything. So the socialist ticket didn't win, but he got a big chunk of votes from a jail cell in Idaho. George Pettibone was the second person that was tried for this. He was described as a rabid anarchist, and he ran a boarding house for WFM members in Denver. And this is one of the things they used to try to argue that the WFM was actually a radical organization, because this guy was clearly radical and he was housing members of this organization. He invented his own incendiary substance called Pettibone dope, which is also going to be my band name from now on. And he had previously been convicted of criminal conspiracy in that previous labor riot in 1892. But he was ultimately acquitted on the same grounds as Haywood. There was just no separate evidence aside from Orchard's testimony. But unfortunately for him, he developed stomach cancer and died a few months after he was acquitted.
Is it related to the Pettibone dope, whatever was in
Yeah, I don't know if he was eating the Pettibone dope or if it was like radioactive. I'm not quite sure what was involved in Pettibone dope, but whatever happened, he was acquitted, but it didn't matter too much. And finally, Charles Munyer was the third person that was charged. He was the president of the WFM for over 2 decades. He became radicalized when he was a minor in Telluride, Colorado. He was arrested during a labor dispute there and held for several months illegally. He actually pursued his case against that all the way to the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court said, we're going to disregard all actual evidence in this case because the good faith of the state should not be questioned. So irregardless of the evidence, the state was right in this case. And that, of course, completely radicalized him. He became the Johnny Appleseed of labor unions, went all across the country, started labor unions, was very anti-government after that. And then, of course, it happened to him all over again when he was grabbed in the middle of the night from Colorado and dragged to Idaho to stand trial for something that was not clear he was ever directly involved in. And again, that was upheld. The Idaho Supreme Court said, yes, this was done illegally, but once you're in Idaho, you still have to stand trial. So. And finally, we have Harry in His Daughtage here. He was the one person that was convicted in this assassination. His actual name was Albert Edward Horsley. He was the longest serving prisoner at the old Idaho State Penitentiary. Presumably it was the new Idaho State Penitentiary when he started. He was eventually allowed to live in a house outside of the prison, and he raised poultry for the prison. And a lot of people were pretty offended by the sort of like kid gloves that he was treated with. I mean, he was a terrorist who killed somebody and was convicted of that murder, and a pretty grisly murder at that. And he kind of got away with sort of aging into this sort of sweet old man. You can find pictures of him. He's like playing with kids out in the yard, and he did like wood whittling or something as a hobby. And so, and it was all kind of like on the state's dime because technically he was a prisoner. And especially the Steunenberg family is kind of offended by the way that he kind of got like this sort of free ride. And after, at 86 years, shortly before he died, he wrote a book that maintained that everything he said was true. So he was still saying that all 17 assassinations were true. He was still claiming that he was hired by the WFM. But a lot of that doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, why would you assassinate somebody 6 years after they're out of office? There wasn't a lot of clear logic for that. He was actually a mine owner himself. He owned 1/16 of the Hercules mine beforehand. So there's slightly more of a motive for him to have a personal grudge against Steunenberg because he lost his ownership stake in the Hercules mine partially as a part of all the different labor stuff that Steunenberg quashed by calling in the army. So just in general, like a lot of aspects of the story don't make a lot of sense, but he was still maintaining that all of that was true 45 years after the fact. And this is the Steunenberg Memorial in Boise. Unfortunately, Zoom is cutting off his head there, but this is where he's described as made of granite. He's still a well-regarded figure in Idaho. So do we have any questions about any of that, or do we want to look at some stuff? We can start looking at stuff while people think about questions here. I'll show it to the camera and then pass it around. Here we have some contemporary coverage of the Steunenberg assassination. Let's see, I probably have to stop sharing my screen. I only have one screen, so I'm guessing what everybody's seeing. Stop sharing. Are you seeing me now, Zoom people? Yes, all right, I'm getting one thumbs up. I'm gonna jump into the chat real fast and see if those are questions. Yes, okay, people heard me before, they're seeing me now. Now you're going to see some contemporary coverage of the Steunenberg assassination, which you can't read, but you can see the disastrous effects of whatever glue they used. I'll pass those around the room here. The Idaho State Archives actually has a really good collection of Steunenberg materials. We can try to digitize the things that we have, but I think a lot of it's redundant to what they have. Here we have actual reports from the Pinkerton Detective Agency that happened at the same time, but you can see they're on that sort of like old school mimeographed paper. But you can read what their undercover agents and so forth actually were reporting back to the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And there was actually a competing detective agency called the Thiel Detective Agency, THIEL, and we have their reports as well. So some competing reports there. One of them was working for the mine owners, and the other one was working for the WFM. This is one of my favorite things. This is the book Greater Love, not only by Frank Steunenberg, but it came out after he died. And it's all about what a great guy Harry Orchard is. So I'm dubious. One element that this I kind of skipped over is about 2 weeks into his incarceration, Harry Orchard converted to Seventh-day Adventism. And after that, he never talked about labor issues or unions ever again. He became a sort of super paragon of Seventh-day Adventism. And so I think this perhaps came from that organization. Even now, you can look online and they have videos and everything about what a great guy Harry Orchard was because of that conversion. And this book kind of plays into that same sort of trope.
What did you stop referring to as Harry Orchard by the other?
Harry Orchard was the pseudonym that he kind of landed on at the end. That's what he was most famous for, so that's what he stuck with.
Okay.
Albert Horsley was his birth name, and then there was a couple of other different pseudonyms along the way.
Okay, I was just wondering why it was bigger as the other culture.
But yeah, his kind of final stage name was yeah, Harry Orchard. Here's a memorial program from his death. It's actually leather bound. It's kind of neat looking in person, but it's got all these sort of testimonials from various people about Frank Steunenberg. We've got conversely a pamphlet about the crimes of the Western Federation of Miners. So this would be sort of an intentionally defamatory document that was trying to throw them under the bus, which is one of the potential motives for the assassination. It was not necessarily that they were trying to kill Steunenberg specifically, but that they were trying to sort of villainize the unions and sort of show that, oh, the unions are made up of these thugs that will do murderous things. And Steunenberg just kind of happened to be the most convenient person at the time and for them to assassinate. So we've got some documentation along those lines. The four promised newsletters for the Western Federation of Miners, which I just like because it definitely has that sort of old communist vibe to it, sort of has that like Soviet aesthetic to it. Yeah, this is from 1911 to 1912.
Okay, it's got that kind of deco-y.
Finally, which will be inaccessible to anybody equally, we've got a whole list of Pinkerton National Detective Agency reports on the Western Federation of Miners on good old microfilm, everybody's favorite media here. So if you're ever here in Moscow, you can come on in and look at this on microfilm. Does anybody else have any questions or anything about Frank Steunenberg or the assassination or the materials that we have here?
So the book, Frank wrote it, and it was.
It's a tribute to Frank Steunenberg, but it's after his death, so there's no way that he actually wrote it.
No, so why do they have his name at the bottom? And then on the end, so was it passed around jail cells or something?
I'm not sure who the original audience for that pamphlet would be, but it was clearly not actually written by Frank Steunenberg.
Well,
So
no, I was like, why does it have his name?
I think we're going to take some time to look at the materials here in the room. If you're not in the room and you don't have any questions, that may be kind of the end of the presentation here.
How did you guys come across all these Pinkerton reports?
That's a good question. I'm not sure why we have them. They're obviously not necessarily originals. They look like they're copies, but
Right.
I think it's just a subject matter that's of high interest to Idaho. So
And these would have been mailed?
yeah, they would have been mailed. Thanks for coming, Michaela.
have published a concept on handbooks about the conflict between evolution and the Bible, clearly set forth in the way of inspiration of the scriptures, the volume we have people really enjoy. So it seems to be a creationist novelization.
Yeah, so we're noticing that the publisher of that Greater Love book that's nominally Frank Steunenberg also published what seems to be a creationist book as well. So there may be a agenda there.
Yes.
Really cool.
And all this is available for you to look at as well. So even if you're not here right now, you can come in later to the special collections reading room and take a look at any of this. And I'm also planning to do some more of these. So if you know of any Idaho crimes you'd want to hear more about, or that you think would be good to be covered.
Can you look at this?
Yeah, go for it. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you. It was very interesting. Do you already have a date for the next one?
It'll probably be next semester.
Okay.
Yeah, it's so cool. It's kind of like that, like almost like Forrest Gump or something from that time period. It was like Clarence Darrow, and then it's like all of these movies are stuff I've heard of. But how did Clarence Darrow like even find out about this case? Was it like a federal?
I mean, it was a nationally famous case.
Papers, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, Kirsten.